Hi, it's Terry Ryder from Hotspotting, bringing you my regular weekly feature at this time, every Tuesday evening, Hotspot of the Week, when I focus on a location somewhere around Australia that I think's got the prospects to outperform the general market, both in the short term and, as always, taking a long-term view. Now, one of the standout markets in Australia in the last 1 to 2 years has been regional Victoria. I think it's fair to say that many of the locations that have delivered the strongest price growth in the last 12 to 18 months have been locations in regional Victoria. Some of those have been just outside of Melbourne in the east. Heading out of Melbourne into Cardinia Shire, we're seeing pretty exceptional growth in locations like Pakenham and Officer. They've both grown somewhere between 20 and 30% in 2018. And then further out in the local government area of Baw, towns like Warragul and Druin have also risen very strongly, and both those locations have seen their prices last year grow by 20% or more. So it appears to us at Hotspotting that the growth is actually moving even further towards the east, out into the Gippsland area. And the area that's caught our attention is the local government area of Latrobe, the Latrobe Valley area. Towns like Traralgon, Morwell, Moe, Churchill. And it may surprise some people that we'd focus on that area, firstly because it's decidedly down market. That's the perception of it. Very, very cheap prices in those areas. And secondly, and perhaps more particularly, because most of the publicity about this area in recent years has been negative, particularly with the closure of major industries like some of the old dirty coal-fired power stations that were part of the economic fabric of that area. And as media has a tendency to focus on negatives and ignore the positives, most of the publicity for that area has been negative. And a lot of people might think those areas don't have a future. But in actual fact, what often happens when an area goes through that kind of change, that evolution from the older dirty smokestack industries to something newer, more modern, cleaner, they actually emerge from that process with a net benefit. We've seen that happen with a number of regional centres around Australia. Newcastle in New South Wales is a great example. When BHP closed down at the end of the 90s, many declared the end of Newcastle as a city, as an economy, but it's recovered, it's come back strongly, and it's thriving. Same happened with Wollongong, where some of its old smokestack industries like BlueScope Steel were downsizing. I remember a headline that said property values were going to fall 50% in Wollongong. That was just a few years ago. Well, Wollongong's economy has continued to grow and thrive, and its property market has shown very strong growth in the last 2 to 3 years. Then we have Geelong, just outside Melbourne, where it's also going through that transition from the old blue-collar industries to a situation where now there's a very, very strong regional city. The major employers are sectors like education and medical services and technology. So out in the Latrobe Valley, with the closure of some of the old coal-fired power stations like Hazelwood, various levels of government have made a concerted effort to make sure that those communities, economically and in terms of the livelihood of families, were not adversely affected. So they've directed resources and money into creating new economies, new industries, to maintain jobs in the area. And it appears they've been pretty successful to date, because many of those communities appear to us to be thriving, and their property markets are starting to rise as a result of that. But it's really part of a process where the focus has been taken away from the traditional sort of coal mining and coal-fired power station sector and steering the Latrobe Valley in a new direction. And there seems to be some considerable success, and plenty more coming up, because as I'll get to later in this presentation, there's quite a lot of projects underway or in the pipeline that are going to continue to create economy and jobs, and therefore demand for real estate. So the area I'm focusing on is about 140 to 165 kilometres east of Melbourne, along the Princes Highway. Towns such as Traralgon, Morwell, Moe, Churchill. The population of this area is about 75,000, projected to grow to about 85,000 in the next 10 to 12 years. So that certainly the authorities are seeing quite strong growth in that area. There's a larger catchment of over 260,000 people stretching across the Latrobe Valley and the Gippsland region. Energy production is still a major part of the economy there. Agriculture is big, paper making and timber, manufacturing and engineering. It's an area that's well connected to Melbourne through the V-Line train network with stations at Trafalgar, Moe, Morwell, Traralgon, etc. But the key thing is the efforts that are being made, the investment that's being put into to create new jobs, and I'll get to what some of those are, and we get to the final part of the presentation, which is future prospects. I do these presentations the way we construct our reports. We start with an introduction. We then talk about the economy and amenities, the location, the population. Then we talk about the property market, and lastly, the future prospects, which I think is the most important part. That's the elements that make us take an interest in the area, what's coming up. It's always about the future with what we do in our research at Hotspotting. The property market, a couple of things stand out. Firstly, it's just how cheap the real estate is out there. The median house price for Morwell is 170,000, Moe's 190,000, Churchill's 175,000, and then Traralgon, which is the biggest town and the most expensive market, but still pretty affordable. The median house price there is 290,000. The next thing that stands out is just how active these markets are. In the last 12 months, there have been 620 house sales in Traralgon, 400 in Morwell, 235 in Moe. So it's a pretty high level of activity in terms of house sales in those markets. The next thing that stands out is how low the vacancy rates are. All the postcodes taking in those various towns of the Latrobe Valley, they all have vacancy rates well under 2%, and some of them are below 1%, so tight rental markets. And as a result of that and the low prices, the rental yields are one of the great attractions for property investors. If you believe there's a future in that area and that prices will grow, the rental yields are certainly attractive. Median yield for the various towns, 6.8%, 6.4%, another one 6.8%. The most expensive market, Traralgon, the yields are around 5.5%. So cheap prices, low vacancies, good rental yields, highly active markets, and we're starting to see some price growth. The growth that we saw firstly in the outer ring areas of Melbourne, then it rippled out to some of the towns just outside of Melbourne, some of which I mentioned earlier, Pakenham, Officer, Warragul. Now we're starting to see some price growth in some of these towns. They're up sort of 4, 5, 6% in 2018. But the way activity is rising there and all the factors that are gathering in the underlying economy, I think we're going to see higher price growth than that in these very affordable markets with good rental returns. So there's been a concerted effort by government to make sure that these communities don't die economically and that jobs are maintained and people still have livelihoods in the wake of the closure of major employers such as the Hazelwood Power Station. And that's an article here from domain.com.au titled "How Morwell Survived the Closure of Its Major Industry and is Starting to Grow Again." It's this article there. These are sorts of things that we look for in our research, amongst many other things, at Hotspotting. And this details the sort of thing I'm talking about, that some media have declared the end of this area economically and the death of the towns because of the closure of some of these big industries and employers. But what we're seeing in the area, quite a lot of investment. There's $260 million being spent on the Princes Highway. There are major upgrades happening to the Gippsland rail network. We've seen the relocation of the Defence Force Academy out to sale, which is not far from the area that we're talking about. That's quite a big investment. There's a plan to build electric cars in the region. There is a university in it's at Churchill, I think. Was originally called Monash University, now it's Federation University Australia. It's about 2,000 students studying on campus there and 5,000 students who study off campus. The energy industry is still big, but it's the investment in the new things that's important. The Princes Highway upgrade, that's 260 million. Upgrades to the rail line out through the Gippsland region, 530 million, that's under construction. The relocation of the pilot training facility from Tamworth in New South Wales to Sale in this area of Victoria is an investment of about $2 billion overall. Then we've got some smaller things that are happening. New cinema complex at Traralgon, $20 million. New government hub being established at Morwell, $25 million. That's an example of state government's efforts to generate jobs in this area in the wake of the closure of power stations. At Traralgon, there's the Latrobe Creative Precinct has been created. That's a $35 million project. There's a solar farm that's approved to be constructed, a $40 million project, a fertiliser plant, $145 million project, a magnesium plant at Morwell, $40 million, and the redevelopment of the Latrobe Regional Hospital, that's a $220 million project. So a lot of money being invested in this area, quite deliberately, in many cases by the federal government, the state government and local councils as well, to make sure that the economy remains vibrant, jobs are created and people's livelihoods to the best as possible are protected. And from everything that we can tell with our research in this area, there's been quite a degree of success. Unemployment rates are coming down, jobs are being created, the economy seems quite vibrant, and demand for real estate in these areas is rising, helped by the affordability, the low vacancies and the high rental yield. So it's one to consider if you're looking for something affordable, you want to take advantage of the growth that we're seeing in the last 1 to 2 years in regional Victoria, which is still ongoing. We've talked previously about strong regional centres in Victoria north of Melbourne, like Ballarat and Bendigo, as coming markets, but out to the east, where we've already seen big growth in Pakenham, Officer, Warragul, Druin. Now we're starting to see an uplift in activity, and we're expecting some pretty solid price growth in towns like Traralgon and Moe and Morwell. So one to consider, particularly if you're an investor on a budget looking for growth prospects with really good rental yields, and keeping in mind that a lot of investors think you've got to make a choice between capital growth or rental return. But I always believe that if you buy in the right places, you can have both. And I think this might be one of those areas. Certainly the rental returns are good. The vacancies are low, rental market's strong. And I think the prospects for some growth from a low base are pretty good in these Latrobe Valley towns. If you'd like to find out more, you can access our location report on this particular location and many others around Australia on the hotspotting.com.au website. That's it for now. Later in the week, I'll be doing my war and misinformation broadcast and various other spontaneous ones as well. So stay tuned. That's it for now. Let's do it again soon.